Hello and welcome to International Forum. Today our program is about India. After decades of relatively unspectacular growth compared to the East Asian economies, India's economy suddenly took off 3 to 4 years ago, growing at 8% or more a year. Last year, 2006, India's economy grew at 9.2%, not far below China's 10.7%, making India the world's second fastest growing economy. Now, today, India is brimming with self-confidence. India's big corporations, the Tatas, the Mittels, go around the globe buying up companies, and there are a lot of foreign companies coming to India, bringing them with money and technology and etc. Now, what was responsible for India's sudden spurt in the growth, and is this growth sustainable, and what are some of the obstacles to sustain high growth, are some of the questions we're going to look at today. And we're also hoping to look at India's, some important aspects of India's international relations, its relations with America, with China, with Pakistan, with the Middle East, for a better and more complete picture of India. Please join me in welcoming our special guest for today, Professor Atul Kohli. Professor Kohli is the David K.E. Professor of International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. His main research interests are in the areas of comparative political economy with a focus on the developing countries. He's the author of a number of books, including The State and Poverty in India, Democracy and Discontent, India's Growing Crises and Governability, and State-Directed Development, Political Power and Industrialization in the Global Periphery. He's also the editor of 6 volumes on development and the recipient of a number of awards and fellowships. Welcome, Professor Kohli,
Thank you,
to our program. Explain to us what propelled India into this, to make this 180 turnaround, growing from, say, a 6% relatively lower relative to the other Asian economies, East Asian economies, to suddenly 8-9%. Was there a single event you can point to?
Probably not. To understand India's economic growth acceleration, you really have to go back about 25 years. India's economy was growing at close to 3 to 4% from about 1950 to 1980. It's a sluggish growth rate. Indians among themselves called it the Hindu growth rate, and that was a matter of used to bring smile to faces. From about 1980 onwards, India growth started accelerating. It sort of picked up and has averaged about 6% for the last 25 years. Last 2 or 3 years that you mentioned have been rather spectacular, but it's not obvious they're part of a long-term trend. The long-term trend, which we are relatively comfortable suggesting is that what's going on, is that India is growing at about 6%.
Okay, we'll talk more about that later. But you mentioned that India's economy went from growing 6% in the 1990s to suddenly growing 8-9% in the last 3-4 years. What is, even if there is no single event, what would you say happened? What was the role of government, for example, in this sudden growth?
The government has liberalized the economy, and that has, of course, been playing a role. But the growth acceleration started almost a decade before that, so the factors are a little more complex. And what has happened in the last 2-3 years, that more foreign investment has started coming in, and the service sector economy in India is booming, and finally even the industrial sector has done a little better. And so those things taken together have pushed the growth rate by a couple of percentage points beyond what India's trend rate has been in the last 25 years. But whether that's an aberration or that's a new trend, it's too early to say right now whether we are on a new growth trend or not.
Now, these good things that's happening to India's economy, then are they related to globalization?
Of course, to an extent they are, but it's important to keep in mind that India's growth started picking up around 1980 when India's economy was relatively closed by global standards. And unlike other East Asian examples, such as China, India's economic growth is sort of driven largely by internal indigenous businessmen and their investment. It's not as dependent on foreign investment. So the Chinese model, as well as other parts of East Asia, such as Malaysia, have grown quite a bit as a result of foreign investment. That is a new part of India's economy, and to the extent that by globalization one means more foreign investment and increased connection to foreign trade, they are playing a role, but India's economic growth is largely being driven by internal investments.
How well would you say India's economy is today integrated into the global economy?
Much better than what it used to be, but by standards of other developing countries, it is still not as integrated compared to some Latin American countries, compared to some East Asian economies. It's not integrated. Trade as a percentage of GDP is not terribly high, and foreign investment is extremely low in percentage terms compared to China's, for example.
Why is that, since there seems to be so many opportunities now?
It's likely to increase, but there is more competition from Indian business. Indian government has been a little more protective of Indian business. They still have rules about which areas foreign investment can come in, which area they cannot come in. And then India is not always the most attractive site for all the foreign investors, partly because the infrastructure is difficult. It has labor problems in the sense that labor unions are relatively well organized. And so those issues add up. It's a democratic context, and you cannot be as certain of what the policies will be. So all of these make it sort of somewhat trickier than a place like China.
Now, what sectors have benefited the most from globalization and increased international trade and investment?
On the trade side, service sector is the one which has been booming the most, in the sense that, and especially within the service sector, the software industry, programming, serving other sort of big American corporations and providing services to them. So when you call American Express, you know, in the daytime or at night especially, somebody in India probably picks up and says, this is John speaking, and it's probably not John at all. It's, you know, it's probably an Indian person with an Indian name in Bangalore responding and serving American Express. And the more and more this type of service provision, given an sort of English-speaking trained manpower is available, and given time change, at night all services can be provided there now, including diagnoses for medical services. So doctors are available because 12-hour time change. They're relatively competent. They speak English, and if the diagnosis can be made online, they do it. And so all of these services are now being provided, and so service sector has become a very fast grower in India, contributing to higher growth rates.
I've personally had experience dealing with these Indian software engineers in the middle of the night. I wait till 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. in the morning, and then you speak to one of them.
Right.
And I can truly attest to the excellence of their service. And now, what sectors have been hurt? Agriculture, because of cheaper imports?
Not yet. No, that's not obvious at all yet. Some of the sort of industry is hurting, but what Indian government has done has opened up very slowly. And so what you're noticing is a fair amount of mergers and acquisitions, meaning less efficient businesses are collapsing into bigger businesses, and so sort of there's churning going on within the Indian sort of private sector. I think it's hard to sort of single out one sector where it is being really hurt, because India has because of lobbying of Indian business, when it starts hurting, Indian government is obliged by creating certain types of protection, at least to an extent. Some of that is difficult increasingly with WTO, the World Trade membership to the World Trading Organization, but still India has been relatively moderate in how quickly it has opened the economy to the outside world.
Okay, let's take a moment to look at India's international relations with some of the very important countries, say the United States. How would you describe that relationship?
It's certainly getting warmer. U.S. and India, in spite of being world's largest democracies, have not always had warm relations. A lot of that had to do with the Cold War. India used to be closer to the Soviet Union, was non-aligned for some time, and then was closer to the Soviet Union, and that was viewed with suspicion in Washington. The world has changed since then, and in the last decade or so, India and the United States have become closer economically as well as politically. So I think it's definitely a warmer relationship. How close it will get remains to be seen.
Yeah, in this relationship, I can't help but think of this outsourcing problem. Americans look at it as a problem because we're losing jobs too, like you mentioned, Indian engineers, software engineers, like that. I mean, do you think, would this hurt outsourcing and trade in services between United States and India, or is this outsourcing going to continue and accelerate regardless?
It's hard to predict. My guess would be it's the latter, that it will continue. You know, the incentive for cheaper services are very strong, and in that sense, of course, the people get hurt and there will be objections, but the United States has fairly strong commitment to free trade, and in that sense, it's likely to lean in the direction of keeping it open. The problems will arise if India does not reciprocate. Then it sort of, can get out of hand. But I think India so far is leaning also towards bringing down barriers and opening their side of the economy as well.
What is India's strategic importance to the United States today, and the vice versa? I mean, for example, is India concerned, or should India be concerned, and for that matter the United States concerned, about the fact that China is building these deep water ports along the western coast of Myanmar, just above the Bay of Bengal?
Sure.
And also direct gas pipelines through the interior of Myanmar directly to China.
These are multifaceted relationships.
Yeah.
And United States clearly has the perception that over the longer term, they can think of India as providing a counterweight to China. That plays into American thinking in terms of the recent nuclear deal in which they're allowing India to pursue its nuclear program.
Civilian nuclear
program.
For energy purposes.
For energy purposes, which of course has relationships to India's sort of armaments and its nuclear industry more broadly.
India has nuclear bombs.
Of course, and India and the United States has made a special exception, to allow India in that sense to join tacitly the nuclear club. And I think the underlying thinking is that by doing that, the United States is creating a new ally in Asia in case the rise of China becomes a threatening type of development, which it is not so far, but it might. And there's some thinking in Washington that that may happen. And so they're hedging their bets, at least partly on India as a democratic English-speaking country, which they may be able to. So strategically, I think that's a very important sort of part in American thinking in terms of future of India and whether it's worth having an ally. And you asked about India's relationship to China. India cannot afford to alienate China. China is far too powerful and significant and dynamic a country. So whether the United States think of them as adversaries or not, India does not think so. India has to try and keep a balanced sort of relationship. In some areas there will be competition, in few areas there will be conflict, but there are many areas of shared interest, sort of economic interest, and trade between India and China is growing quite significantly.
What are India's comparative advantages compared to China? Because both are competing for the same market or different markets?
Somewhere along the line, there will be competition in terms of, sort of exports and in terms of,
But right now, are the exports of the two countries sort of different in nature, in the composition?
Yes. China has been in light manufacturing, and India has been in the service sector.
Labor-intensive.
Labor-intensive, light manufacturing.
Whereas India?
More in the service sector, educated manpower.
Skill-intensive.
Skill-intensive, more so.
So they're sort of both selling to the global market, but selling different things.
That is correct, but India wants to get into manufacturing exports. India has a strong desire to not be a service-dependent economy. And in that sense, when that comes around and they move into labor-intensive manufactured exports, there will be competition.
Now, how does the rise of India affect the rest of Asia, in particular the developing countries of Southeast Asia?
Well, ASEAN is where this will sort of play itself out. ASEAN has been debating whether to expand itself to include China, Japan, Korea, as well as
ASEAN is the Association of East Asian
economies that is centered in Southeast Asia. And that's sort of where Southeast Asian interests get expressed. And in terms of possibility of broader economic integration in Asia, can Asia emulate what has happened in Europe itself? Can there be an Asian common market? That's a type of issue that is being debated.
But has India's rise been good for Southeast Asia?
For Singapore, sorry, I'm sorry.
No. It's just like how does that American expression go? A rising water raises all boats?
Yeah. It's, I don't think the economic integrations are so tight so far that you can claim that it's, raising all boats with the economic rise. Singapore is getting more and more involved, and Korean investment is coming into India. So economic growth in India is definitely connected to those two. ASEAN has given India an observer status, which means that it's not impossible to imagine a more integral role of India in East Asian economy if it moves in that direction. But these are trends that are unfolding rather than definite, and that they can be analyzed with any certainty at this point.
I want to ask you about this term CHIME, C-H-I-M-E, which apparently refers to this economic zone that consists of China, India, and the Middle East, thus CHIME. How far has this progressed, CHIME progressed?
I am not aware of any sort of arguments which say that this is a single economic zone.
But has the potential of becoming one?
Middle East is embroiled in so many security issues that it's not obvious it's ready to join, sort of, and focus mainly on economic development. Middle East oil is critical to rise of India and China, and in that sense it's very much part of the economic process. But sort of in the very near future, many Middle East countries, if they are able to achieve peace and security, would probably want to diversify away from oil dependence. That's sort of that can only be a short-term sort of source of revenue, and that process has not started. So I think the possibility of India playing greater role vis-a-vis East Asia is more alive than an economic zone getting established across East Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East.
India and Russia, they are building ties based on energy and, I suspect, strategic security. Russia is selling oil to India, and Russia is helping to build nuclear power plants in India.
That's a very important relationship. Frankly, I was surprised at how warmly Putin was received in India in the last visit just last month. Over the last few weeks, it has unfolded. I thought after the warm embrace between the United States and India that India will put some distance between itself and Russia, especially on defense issues, on procurement of armaments, because that is one area where I thought there would be a quid pro quo from India in terms of buying arms from the United States and more from Western markets. The resurgence of that relationship is a little reminiscent of the Cold War years when Soviet Union and India were very warm, had warm relationships integrated to each other. So it surprised me a little bit. But in sort of thinking about it more carefully, strikes me India has not veered as far away from its old traditional foreign policy of trying to maintain sort of warm relations with several powers. You know, it has to be closer to the United States now because the world has changed. The United States is the single most powerful country in the world. It'll be a suicidal act not to be friendly to the United States. And so, as realpolitik thinking people, Indians have embraced the United States. But I don't think they want to do that at the expense of either alienating China or at the expense of endangering old, warmer relationships with Russia.
I'd like to talk with you about your concerns for India today. What concerns you? You mentioned earlier that you doubt, you have questions about whether this high rate of growth is sustainable. Is it because the necessary conditions for this high growth rate just aren't there in India?
That would not be my central concern. My central concern for India is that a large majority of Indians may not be benefiting from this growth. It's not as equitably distributed as one would like it to be distributed.
And why is that?
Well, inequalities are growing in India, and poor, of course, benefit when there is high growth because their incomes rise. But if inequalities also rise, then poverty does not get alleviated as rapidly as it might if inequalities were not increasing. And this is something India and China share these days, is sharply increasing income inequalities. In India, this is across regions. Some regions are being left behind, others are moving ahead because some regions attract foreign investment and private investment from within India, others don't. Government is playing less and less of a role in providing investment to more backward areas, so you get regional disparities growing. You're getting city versus countryside inequalities growing. Less public money is going into the countryside. Cities are getting a lot more private investment, so the people in the countryside are being left behind. And you also get class inequalities growing within cities because the rich get richer more rapidly than the poor, who are benefiting but not as rapidly. So you get inequalities increasing on a variety of dimensions, which has political implications and which has implications for how fast the poor benefit from economic growth. And so if I have concerns, it is sort of more in that direction. I think economic growth is doing all right. It's doing quite all right. And if it's not 9%, if it's 8%, 7, 8% range, that's very handsome economic growth rate. That should not be way up on anybody's mind as a matter of concern. Matter of real concern is whether majority of Indians will benefit from this process or not.
I did see this very sad statistic about this income inequality, that in the last 7 years, poverty rate in India reduced from 47% to 46%, 1 percentage point decrease in poverty in the last 7 years, while its economy has been growing at 8, 9% a year.
Yes, the data you're quoting is on child malnutrition. That's not on poverty. Poverty figures are different. The figure you're quoting in New York Times, which came out of a report published by a French economist who lives in India, Jean Drèze, and the article was by Somni Sengupta, the New York Times editor. That is a child malnutrition data, and it's very sad indeed. It's a very telling data, and it speaks to what I said is my concern, that child malnutrition decreased by only 1 percentage point while economy continues to grow. And that should be on top of mind of any concerned citizen.
And the same report also mentioned that almost half of India's children under 3 to 5 years old are malnourished.
Yes, that's precisely what I think ought to be of concern, is this inequitable distribution of growth.
But who can do what to change the situation?
The government will have to play a leading role. You know, it is impossible to imagine a substantial alteration in this trend without public intervention, whether it's in the form of some public investment, whether it's in the form of creating jobs, public works programs, whether it's in terms of deliberately intervening to improve education and health. There are a number of important areas where the government can do something, and that which itself is a function of, you know, who is in power and who votes them in power and what type of parties are in, you know, sort of ruling parties. And so it's a democratic country, and in a sense it's hard to imagine that there will not be a reaction to the inequitable growth process.
But it seems to me that the government's hands are rather tied, because the government has a very large deficit and is running current account deficits. And so something like a third of the government's revenues in income taxes it takes in goes to pay interests on its debt.
No, that is correct. That's precisely, you know, one of the real constraints there. But there is ample room for increasing revenue intake. India's agricultural sector, for example, remains largely untaxed. And even though agrarian incomes have gone up, that remains untaxed. More important, because agricultural incomes aren't that high, and the moral case for taxing people who are not growing as fast is not that strong. But most important, the service sector is not taxed adequately. And so that's where a lot of, you know, if a proper government can try and figure out how to increase the revenue intake and then how to redistribute it somewhat more effectively.
Muslims in India, Muslims, 1/6 of the population in India are Muslims. Are they by and large a very peaceful group? How well integrated are they into the larger Indian society? Do you worry that they could become radicalized, like apparently some Muslims in, say, in the UK, born there, educated there, but they're radicalized to the extent that they engage in bombings?
It's always possible. Of all the worries in my mind, that would not be way up there. Islam in India is on the whole more moderate than in other parts of the world. It has been practiced and is more tolerant, and Muslims and Hindus have, you know, often lived peacefully together, though there is history of incredible bloodshed during the partition years then, and then sporadic violence in Gujarat and Bombay. They are not well integrated, and the latest report by government shows that they are being left behind in material progress compared to Hindus. And that's a serious concern. But the fact that government itself took the lead in bringing that point to public attention suggests, in part, government's electoral interests. So one should not think these are all high and mighty actions. But the fact that this type of report the government publishes itself suggests that they're thinking about it. And once it becomes part of the public discourse, this type of issue, some action is likely to follow. So I think India does have a democratic built-in mechanisms for addressing some such issues.
Quickly, India and Pakistan. How do they get along? Have the prospects for war between the two countries receded into the background? Probably
yes. It's a troubled relationship. It's been a troubled relationship ever since the emergence of the two countries. A variety of new ideas on Kashmir are in the air, are being discussed. How far they will go is, right now it's hard to predict. But things don't look as bad as they looked 3 to 5 years back.
So it's unlikely that there will be a nuclear confrontation between India and Pakistan?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Professor Atul Kohli on India. Thank you for watching. I'm Mei Chang for International Forum. See you next time.